As you start joining our webinar tonight for the Kohima Educational Trust, we've got an absolute um, belter for you tonight with Lucy Betteridge-Dyson. Um, we've got about 190 people coming, joining us tonight from all around the world. I can see you all popping in. That's really exciting. If you, when you, if you've got a question, make sure that you put it in the question box or the chat box and say hello to each other. And at the end, Lucy and I will answer any questions you've got. If we struggle to do that, then we'll do it by email. But we've got some old friends. I see Darren's joining us again. I think we're going to be talking about Arakan today, Darren, so you'll be very pleased. Um, and we've got friends from India and Canada and a little place called Scotland and further afield, which is very exciting. And it's time for me to hand over to Sylvia to get things started.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. And hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. So lovely to see our regular team, Darren and others, all experts, or some of you are experts, certainly, but all of you are friends joining us this evening. And a very warm welcome to all of you who are new to our KET programme, as there are quite a few of you, I think, joining us tonight for the first time. And for your information, all of our previous webinars are free to view on our YouTube channel and all through our website. But tonight it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Lucy Betteridge-Dyson, who will be taking us through the story of the Third Battle of Arakan. As is our wont, we like to try and focus on the lesser known parts of the Burma campaign. And whilst the 14th Army's dramatic advance and famous victory in 45 is relatively well told, it would not have been possible without another offensive taking place along the western coast in the Arakan, where 15 Corps were tasked with stopping the Japanese 28th Army. In a series of daring combined operations and deep penetration missions into the Burmese jungle, Royal Marine and Army Commandos, alongside the men of the 25th and 26th Indian Infantry and the 81st and 82nd West African Divisions combined, they inflicted a devastating defeat on an enemy once thought unbeatable. Lucy is a military and animal historian, which we will come back to, author and PhD candidate at the Defence Studies Department, King's College London. She has a strong personal connection to the Burma campaign, in particular this battle, as her grandfather, Captain Sims, was involved in it, serving with 44 Royal Marine Commando. Lucy has also chosen this as the subject of her first book, Jungle Commandos, more of which later. Leading us all on is the redoubtable Robert Lyman, who I'm sure you all know, but for those who don't, he is the eminent expert on the Burma campaign, currently writing the definitive account of the Battle of Kohima. One of the many other things he does is host, together with fellow historian Jack Boucher, a brilliant podcast called The Forgotten War, which is not to be missed, and they've got Katrina Child on Saturday. As always, go for the chat button. You're all at it already. Questions, please, on the Q&A. That's important, so Rob and Lucy can pick them up easily at the end. And enough from me. Over to you, Rob, to introduce tonight's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia. You have actually said most of it, but I'm just going to repeat a lot of that tonight. And I'm going to start by a little plug for Lucy's magnificent book. Lucy, I'm incredibly impressed with this. It has taken a while, but you eventually got there. I think you produced the book and the baby at the same time. So congratulations are due on both counts.
Thank you.
But I have to say this book, look, you know, we've been talking about the Burma campaign for, well, I've been talking about it for most of my life, so 35 or 40 years. And most of that time for me, it's been to a resounding silence in academia and in published histories of the campaign. I mean, I was studying this at the time. Louis Allen wrote his marvelous book in 1984. Since then, there have been a tiny handful of books on the campaign, some of them not very good. We are now in the sunlit uplands of the Burma campaign, I'm proud to say. And Lucy is one of the historians out there making history for us and for the campaign. I'm not sure whether you're going to talk about TED tonight, Lucy, but certainly when I first met you, this was the thing that drove you more than anything else, the experience of your grandfather. And Ted Symes is mentioned a number of times in the book, of course. But this book is not just about the commandos. I think the titles, everyone needs a title, and often the title is not chosen by you as a historian, it's chosen by the publisher. It's a good title, but it doesn't say everything that needs to be said about her marvelous book, because the book ranges from the strategic all the way down to the tactical. We've got a really, really cool mix. And if you're not au fait yet with the Arakan campaign in 1945, or even in 1944, or even in 1942, don't be ashamed, because actually this is a really good entree to the campaign. And it demonstrates just how brilliant the campaign was planned and how quite extraordinarily the campaign was executed. So you're in for a treat. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the webinar. Lucy, I'm not going to say anything more. We'll pick up at the end if there are any questions that come in the Q&A box, but we'll just hand over to you to tell us about Jungle Commandos.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, no, I like you said, I was inspired to write the book because my grandfather was in 4/4 Royal Marine Commando. But then, I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to tell the story of 3 Commando Brigades, the only Commando Brigade to serve in the Far East. But as I got looking into it, I realised that actually nobody had told the story of the 3rd Arakan in its sort of comprehensive detail as a whole. And what I was finding out, the achievements of every single division in this campaign was just deserves their own book on their own rights, really. But I thought, I'm going to start and give an overview, because it wasn't something that had been done really. And so that's kind of what the book is about. Jungle Commandos, the name, yes, it's about the commandos. That was also the nickname given to the 81st West African Division. I think they had a little pamphlet that they published, which was called Jungle Commandos, but not many people know that. So we'll just start with this graphic, which I stole from Rob ages ago and then adapted because I didn't know how to do shapes on PowerPoint. So thanks, Rob. Just to give an overview of where the 3rd Arakan sits within the wider Burma campaign. And I'm sure many of you watching tonight will be aware, but just for those who maybe are new to finding out about the Burma as a whole, we really officially, Operation Romulus, which was the name of the 3rd Arakan campaign, began in December, but realistically it started almost as soon as the 2nd Arakan campaign ended. There was continuous fighting through the monsoon season, skirmishes going on. And so, I always like to think about it as kind of like really July, August 44. Officially, it's December. And, this is a pivotal time in the war in Burma. We've got the first Arakan campaign that had occurred in 43, which was this unmitigated disaster, essentially. And I'm sure, I don't know if you've had somebody on to talk about that, or if Rob, you've covered that, but that's we can't get further from where we end up. There was a real kind of hard lessons that were learned during that. We then had a reorganisation of Allied forces and this huge evolution in the Indian and British Army fighting in Burma. And we begin to see the first real successes and fruits of that labour coming through in the 2nd Arakan campaign. And we've got the failure of Yugo and obviously Kohima and Imphal at that point. So by mid-1944, we're really at this point where it's a cliche, but the turn of the tide in Burma. And it's off the back of that there is this desire to try again for Arakan. And of course, this is really the 2 men that were, there's many that were really important in this, but these are 2 that I've picked for a particular reason. Of course, Bill Slim, but I also want to mention Mountbatten. Now, he's a divisive character, not just from his personality, but also some of his contributions. For me, he's closely linked with 3rd Arakan because of his background and his as Chief of Combined Operations. And he was the man who really wanted the commandos in Burma. Both Slim and Mountbatten, they really got to grip with the huge challenges that were facing the British and Indian Army in Burma. they focused on not only getting the health of the troops, making that a big priority, but also in developing new tactics. And the biggest thing really is morale. For me, that's one of the biggest turnarounds during this period in Burma. It's just breaking this myth of the Japanese Superman. They both toured the front lines and really instilled pride in their men of being part of the Forgotten Army. They turned that on its head. And that was something which we see in 15 Corps during Third Arakan. They really came to wear this badge of the Forgotten Army with pride, doing what they did and all those successes as well as anybody else could in the war, but with far fewer resources and with far greater challenges in some ways. So by the summer of 1944, they were keen to build on the success of the Second Arakan, and they had this belief really that Burma was now well within their grasp, and they began planning for the huge Allied offensives. When we think of commandos, of course, we don't necessarily think of Burma. Just for those who aren't super familiar with the commandos as a force, they were formed in 1941 for irregular warfare. They were reorganised more times than you could write a book on, to be quite honest. It is very, very confusing, which kind of suits the fact of what they were tasked with doing in the first place. But by 1943, all you need to know is that the mixed brigades were formed. So Army Commandos, who were the original commandos, plus these new Royal Marine units, of which my granddad joined. And they were originally called Special Service Brigades, these mixed brigades, shortened to SS. That didn't work out for obvious reasons. They decided to rename them, and each brigade of commandos was given a theatre to operate in, essentially. The one we're interested in, 3 Commando Brigade, had 1 and 5 Army Commando, 4-2, 4-4 Royal Marine Commando, 3 Troop Royal Engineers, and I would mention here that 1 and 5 Commando were experienced. These were the guys that were bringing that sort of battle hardened, they'd been at the forefront of action, they'd been out there, they'd cut their teeth. 4-2 and 4-4 were new to the war, and many of these men hadn't been involved in any kind of frontline action. They hadn't seen anything at all. They were straight from training, and this was their first taste of conflict, really. And there was this kind of initially a bit of conflict between the Army and Marine Commandos, but actually that became a great strength for them. On the journey over to Burma, they trained together, and this kind of inter-service competitiveness really cemented between them, pushing them higher. And so they ended up, this became a great strength for them, essentially. Commander originally, Wilfred Nonweiler, he was he was well loved by his troops. Unfortunately, he became ill in around about November 1944, so he didn't actually lead the guys through their main part in the Burma campaign, but he was there for their earlier operations. They'd had a few sort of skirmishes, and they did take part in the Second Arakan in a few places, in Operation Screwdriver 1 and 2. We've also got Peter Young, an absolute legend in commando lore, to be honest with you. He took over from Nonweiler when he became ill. He was second in command and took over for a short period, just before the arrival of Campbell Hardie in December 1944. That was actually the same time that my grandfather joined them in December 44. And that was really how they were set for this start of this big offensive. So the question might be, just quickly on Arakan, why are we bothered about this? If we're going to Rangoon, if we're cutting down the centre of Burma, as Sylvia mentioned, is Slim's big advance, why does Arakan matter? Well, to understand that, we've got to look at this map, and we've got to understand the logistics of things. Arakan borders the western coast of Burma, so it's borders India and the Bay of Bengal. And it's separated by this huge mountain range, the Arakan Yomas. And actually, within Arakan itself, it is littered with mountain ranges, and one can't imagine. And actually, I would take the time to have a look on Google Earth if you can, fly over Arakan, move around, and you will see how extraordinarily just diverse and crazy the landscape is. It really is. It's a spur of the Himalayas, and it kind of splits off, and you end up with like this kind of skeletal hand reaching down. And you know, the reason why it was important were a few key airfields. So you can see on this map, we've got Akyab marked out. Now, on Akyab, there was an airfield. There was also one on Ramri Island, which was a little further to the southeast, and another little one on Chedjua. And these were important because as Slim was pushing down the centre of Burma, they were running out of the limit of, they're reaching the limit of the air supply from the existing air supply areas. And those the lines on there, so the red line was the limit of the air supply from Kohima, purple is Akyab, and blue is from Ramri. And so you can see that if 14th Army were going to make it any way down the centre of Burma, certainly if they were going to make it to Rangoon, then they would need to capture these airfields in Arakan in order to do so, because without it, absolutely no chance of relying on overland communication and line of communication there. So they had to do this. It was really the logistical linchpin of the entire 1944-45 campaign to retake Burma. The task of securing Arakan was given to 15 Corps. It was a truly multinational force led by Lieutenant General Sir Philip Christison. He's a very interesting chap. My research, I ended up not really knowing what to make of him, to be honest with you. In some things I really respected about him. He was very, very keen on making sure the health of his troops was up to stay. He was very, very strict on anti-malarial drill. He was always out visiting his troops. He had some fantastic ideas as a commanding officer, but at the same time, he seemed to be a little bit, sort of generous with the truth when it came to his achievements. And this is something that when I spoke to a friend of mine who knew a little bit more about Christie's background in the First World War, that's a theme that seemed to follow him through his military career. And there's some bits in his memoirs and I'm reading, and then I'm looking at like other accounts and they're just completely different. You know, he's like, oh, I flew over this bit, I did this, I did that. And then when you look at it, it's like it was nowhere near there. So yeah, I don't know. What is true is he had a very personal connection to the Burma campaign. He lost his son, I think, in 1942. So this was not just, a career thing for him. This was not just him doing his own duty. It was personal for him. And I think, no matter what we kind of think about his personality, none of this would have happened without him, because he was very, very dedicated to his troops, and certainly to this operation. So just quickly, and I'll speak a little bit about these guys individually, but the 4 divisions making up 15 Corps, 26th Indian Infantry Division, they were quite experienced. They'd fought in the Second Arakan. 25th Indian Infantry Division, these guys were completely green. They were new to the battle. They were originally raised for the defence of India. So most of the chaps, although some of the units, had seen action, most of them, the majority, were untested in battle. And then we've got the 81st and 82nd West African Divisions. They were raised from units of the Royal West African Frontier Force and comprised of men from across British West Africa. So, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Gold Coast. And then, of course, we had 3 Commando Brigade and the other sort of supporting units. So it was a remarkably diverse force, typical of the Burma campaign. And it had all kinds of different languages, different cultures, different religions going on, which made command of operations. That's a challenge in itself. Never mind how you're dealing with all the different logistics and meeting all the needs of these men. So a really, really special corps in my opinion. So their success depended on combined effort of all of these men in close cooperation as well. We can't forget the Navy and the Air Force. And I think the Navy in Burma is something that we often don't think about and we don't talk about very much. The role played by the Navy in Third Arakan, I can't overstate it. And I try and talk about it a bit in the book, but it is difficult because it's, I just didn't have the space. I'd love to kind of come back to it and do a full book on this kind of stuff, because I think, we think of Burma, we think of all the land and all the different landscapes and different environments. We don't often think of the sea, and the reason why it's so important in Arakan, which we'll come on to, is the Chungs and the river warfare that took place. So Naval Task Force 64, these were the guys. They were amazing, and they were led by a chap called Duncan Codwise Hill, whose name you probably won't know, but everybody should know a little bit more about him, and we should remember his contributions, because man, was that guy long suffering and what he had to deal with. So the success of all of this depended on great cooperation between the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, Royal Air Force Group 224, and they realised that the enemy basically would be no pushover. Let me tell you. The broad plan, as you'll see in this graphic here, was essentially like originally Operation Romulus was kind of phased, and it changed so much over time, because Christie just didn't realise how it was going to pan out, and the success that they would have. So originally it started with a three-pronged approach: this drive down the Mayu Range in the west of Arakan, a drive down the Kaladan Valley towards Myohong, and then the 82nd West African Division would start on Mayu Range and then cross over. And that was the original plan. All the stuff underneath that comes later, and there really was a very excellent, yes, Rob's holding up a book of a book written about the Royal Navy in Burma. So the enemy they're going to be facing, Japanese, opposing 15 Corps Japanese 28th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai. Main units, 54th and 55th Divisions. Despite, obviously, the defeats at Kohima and Imphal, the Japanese were still an incredibly dangerous and determined enemy. Yes, they were on the back foot, but they were it was no means game over at this point. The Bushido Code, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the entire ideology behind the Japanese army meant that they were not going to surrender, and they were going to continue to essentially to fight to the death and to do whatever they could to stop the Allies advancing, even if it felt at the time that they didn't have as much hope as they previously had done. Their tactics really speed and decisiveness, rapid outflanking maneuvers by lightly armed infantry, and they were masters of jungle terrain. And they really, despite the kind of change in tactics that the British and Indian forces had shown during the second Arakan, they were still very, very capable of using their sort of surprise and momentum to overwhelm the Allies. By late 1944, Sakurai, however, was quite low on troops, and he was defending a huge area, about 400 by 150 miles, and he only had, really the 54th Division, because by this point the 55th Division had moved back. A majority of their troops had moved away, so he decided to split Arakan into three different areas. He had a holding area, and the aim of that, and that was basically the Mayu Peninsula, and the aim in this area was just to stop the Allies advancing. They weren't going to be attacking, they just were trying to check the advance as much as they could. They then had a counter-attack area, which was a little bit further to the southeast in the Kaladan Valley. And then this kind of the grand battle area was going to be across the Arakan Yomas and into the Irrawaddy Valley as well. So that was kind of the broad plan. It wasn't to be on the offensive, it was to defend as long as possible and to stop Christie's men advancing and hold Arakan for as long as they possibly could. Christenson's plan, as we've said, was this three-pronged advance. At this point, they were well aware of the kind of terrain they'd be facing, and of course they'd got much more to grips with fighting in the jungles and fighting in the mountains and how the Japanese operated. But there were many surprises still in Arakan. Large areas of it were completely uncharted. Yes, they had observation from the Royal Air Force, but in areas like the Kaladan Valley, that doesn't help you a lot. So there was still a lot of kind of uncertainty about how all of this was going to pan out. The first phase of Operation Romulus began with the 25th Indian Infantry Division on the 12th of December. And the first limited objective, all they were trying to do, I say all they were trying to do, it's something the Allies couldn't do for the first two times, was to capture Akyab Airfield. And they'd set a very sort of generous timeline of the 18th of February to do this. The 81st Division were going to be operating behind the lines in the Kaladan Valley. And they'd been there since early 1944, and their aim really was to provide protection to this advance by the 25th Indian Infantry Division, known as the Ace of Spades. 25th Indian Infantry Division, as I said, many of the troops had not seen battle before. They had actually been brought in to hold the line during the Second Arakan, and they'd been carrying out sort of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering for a few months before the beginning of Operation Romulus. They'd worked with V-Force, who I know Rob and Jack have been talking about in their podcast as well. So check that out to find out a little bit more. V-Force kind of clandestine operations behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. And they'd been working quite closely with the 25th Indian Division to help with that. And they'd managed to secure this lateral route across the May Peninsula, the only route really across on the old railway tunnels. Their advance down the May Peninsula, at first, there was this idea that it was going to be very, very tricky because they believed that there were quite a large number of Japanese troops in the area. It turned out there wasn't. And actually, what had been happening is these Japanese had been split up into very small units and had been told to move around as much as possible to try and give this impression that there were a far greater number of troops there than there actually were. Nevertheless, there was some vicious fighting in this first kind of in this beginning of Operation Romulus, and much of it, these early battles, this photo here is on a hill called Hill 1433. I think it's 1433. It might be Tiger. Unfortunately, there's no record of this image other than what I've worked out from it. It's been lost from the Imperial War Museum, evidently, and I've got the only copy of it, I think. And this is the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles. And they were experienced guys. They'd been part of Wingate's operations. And they spent 4 days in very, very brutal combat, gaining these 2 hills. And this is at the very, very top of the May Peninsula as well. Close quarter fighting to dislodge the Japanese. And they'd suffered heavy casualties. There are some amazing accounts on the Imperial War Museum audio archives that I would urge, if anybody hasn't checked that out yet or is unfamiliar with it, it's really worth doing. Just go on there, pop in a search term and listen to these guys talking, because I think that's I was in tears listening to some of it when I was researching for the book, and the accounts of Dominic McNeil in this battle in particular are very, very moving. Despite the heavy casualties, they managed to secure these 2 hills, which meant that Operation Romulus could begin without the enemy overlooking them, essentially. And it really set the tone for what would be a methodical but determined push down the May Peninsula by the division. This map here shows their advance down from Mongdor down to Foul Point at the very tip of the peninsula. Now, originally, it had been the idea that the 25th Division would stop at Foul Point, and then the 26th Indian Infantry Division would come in and they'd do the amphibious landings on Akyab, led by 3 Commando Brigade. But because 25th Division had advanced so incredibly quickly, they'd managed to cover this entire stretch in about 2 weeks. So they actually ended up at Foul Point before Christmas, and they were originally intended to get there on the 18th of February. So, months ahead of schedule. It was decided that they were going to be the ones to move forward with the attack on Akyab. And this is something that the Allies had failed to achieve. They tried twice to capture Akyab before. So this was a real massive achievement for a division which had its doubters. At this point, even in end of 1944, 1945, many were still unsure really, or were not as believing that the Indian troops could perform as well as the British troops. And this really, in my eyes, put complete pay to all of that. And so as Christmas approached, they were planning for this change of plan, and this is a theme in the 3rd Arakan campaign, a change of plan, that the 25th Indian Infantry Division were going to take Akyab with 3 Commando Brigade. As they were preparing for this, and this huge, this was a huge naval operation. So Duncan Codwise Hill, who I mentioned earlier, he had been asked to put together no fewer than 4 separate plans, Talon 1, 2, 3, 4, all different ideas and occasions of what what might be on Akyab and what the intelligence might bring, and when the 25th Indian Infantry Division would make it to Foul Point. He'd had to put together these huge battle plans. And in the end, despite having worked flat out for about 2-3 months on this, he was told, don't worry about any of that. Actually, we're going to do something completely different. You've got to work with this separate division now. And then this intelligence started to trickle in that actually the Japanese had left Akyab and that there wasn't going to be this need for this huge armada. And he was told to put together a new plan, he got like 48 hours notice to do it, to land 3 Commando Brigade on Akyab. This was Operation Lightning, which obviously suits. And that took place on the 3rd of January 1945. And what had happened is basically the West Africans had advanced so quickly down the Culloden Valley that the Japanese had to pull back from the May Peninsula and Akyab or risk getting cut off. The operations by the West Africans had originally been defensive in nature, had turned into this quite dramatic offensive, and they really had the Japanese on the run, and they had no choice but to pull out or be completely cut off. So Akyab happened. They decided to do it as take the advantage to you as a sort of training exercise. The commandos, many of them actually were not relieved, but were quite disappointed. This was going to be a huge moment of glory for them, and actually strolling onto the beach to, no Japanese and kind of no defence whatsoever was a bit of a damp squib for them. But on the plus side, there was no casualties and it was all quite relaxed. And they'd have to wait for their kind of big moment, but it was going to come. So as I mentioned, the West Africans, and I've got a map here. This is a very, very simplified map. It is so difficult to put the West Africans' movements in the Culloden into a map because they were all over the place. And these guys did not stop moving. The 81st West African Division, this was their second their second advance down the Culloden. And some of them had only been back at their camp in Chiringa for like a month or so, and they were back out again. They were operating just continuously. And it was very, very complex terrain. Again, lots of mountain ranges they had to cross. And they were fighting a very, very experienced force led by General Koba. Notwithstanding kind of the efforts and the achievements of the 25th Division, none of what happened in Akyab would have occurred without the 81st West African Division. They navigated incredibly harsh terrain, and they had to cut their way through dense virgin jungle. And what is most amazing about it is they did it all pretty much without any transport, and they had a few mules, but not much. Most of it was head loaded. And this is a traditional African way of carrying supplies and logistics, was to carry it themselves. They had auxiliary units. I don't like to say anything negative about Bill Slim, but do have to point out he said that these auxiliary units were a waste of time and he didn't like them because he thought they weren't armed. Well, yeah, he was totally wrong. So sorry, Rob. And actually these guys were essential because they allowed the West Africans to move quickly. They allowed them to be incredibly mobile within the Culloden Valley, to get to places where not even mules could go. And these guys were, I've covered it in the book as best I can, but it really needs more work doing. And I know that there are people now who are working. Matt Taylor, who actually got in touch with me just yesterday, he's working on kind of exploring more about the West Africans and writing more about what they did. I don't have time to go into a lot of it today because I'm trying to give you an overview of the campaign. But essentially, like I said, they threatened to cut off Sakura's force in the May Peninsula, and they had Matsu force under General Koba under a lot of pressure, and they were just incredible pushing south. And the idea was that they were going to meet the rest of the division at they were going to meet the 82nd West African Division, who were equally as impressive, at Myo Hung. The 82nd West African Division had cut across, again, cutting their way through jungles, over mountains to meet with their fellow West African Brigade at the ancient Arakanese capital of Myohong, which was a Japanese strongpoint. And they were really going to be, it's a bit of an overdone phrase, but the hammer on the anvil of the 25th and 26th Indian Infantry Division. And I think it's worth pointing out that at this stage, again, this was all kind of happening ad hoc. So Christensen was really having to direct his divisions here on plans that were quite last minute. So a lot of this is planned. You know, the guys are given like 24 hours advance to plan their maneuvers. And particularly the West Africans really took Christensen by surprise. He didn't have much faith in them at all, which is why he kind of just gave them the role of, just keep the Japanese out of Mayu. When he heard from Loftus-Tottenham, the 81st West African Division commander, how well they were doing, he didn't really know what to do with them. He kept giving them different objectives. It was very, very confusing. In the end, I get the impression Loftus-Tottenham, who was a very, very competent commander, he's a general who name you probably won't know. He's one of many in the Burma campaign who's just a phenomenal commander, but who just seems to have slipped under the radar of history. I kind of got the impression really that he was just doing his own thing in the Claddon. He knew what to do. He knew his men. He trusted them. He had absolute faith in the West Africans, again, where others didn't. And he took the bull by the horns. So what we end up with at this point then, so we get to West Africans pushing down on the west of Arakan. We've got the 25th Indian Division and Akyab captured on the west, the West Africans on the east. Bit confusing there. I'm quite tired. I've got a 6-month-old baby. Just going to put that out there. And what we end up with then is this combination of what do we do? We've got the Japanese on the back foot here. We need to take the initiative. And so with just 72 hours notice, Naval Task Force 64 were told that they had to mount an operation to land at a place called Maibon. Maibon was further southeast, so we're continuing to drive the Japanese down Arakan. And they were given just 72 hours to plan this huge operation of landing 3 Commando Brigade on the Maibon Peninsula, which you can see a map on your left. And then again, Google Earth, just phenomenal for kind of visualizing these landscapes. And it was a huge task for the divisional commanders. This landing was going to be 3 Commando Brigade, followed by elements of the 25th Indian Infantry Division. They were going to push up. So we've got the West Africans coming down to Myohong, and then you've got coming up from Maibon, and this idea that they're going to meet, and then they're going to continue to push the Japanese further down Arakan and cut them off. Again, it required just incredible inter-service cooperation. It was an amazing feat to pull it all off. Worth mentioning that Hunter's Bay, so the bay that Maibon sits in, was completely uncharted areas of it. So we had the COP we had the COP units going in for reconnaissance beforehand, but other than that, there was very little known. D-Day was set for the 12th of January. And at 7:30 a.m, the first wave of commandos hit the beaches. Here they are. I love this photo because I always think my granddad could be in it somewhere, which I think is really cool. By mid-afternoon, the first wave, 4, 2, 5 and 1 commandos were all ashore, making their way inland. But as 4 Commander approached towards later in the day, things began to unravel quite quickly. By this time, the tide had receded. And if you look at this photo of Maibon, this satellite image, you will see this big black mass off of the coast. And that is a huge mud flat. And this was something that they had not anticipated, even though the COP parties did know about it and they did report back. For whatever reason, the divisional commanders chose to ignore it or think it wasn't particularly important. Well, it was, because 4 Royal Marine Commando got stuck in it and they couldn't get close to the beaches. Men found themselves getting out of this landing craft about 400 yards out from the shore, stuck in mud, waist deep mud. exposed to enemy fire, although the majority of it, thankfully, had been paid to by the previous units who had gone ashore. But it was a real hairy moment. I think, yeah, I got this quote here. I'm just gonna have to move this out of the way to read it, but this describes it much better than I could. Officers, troop sergeant majors, and even the regimental sergeant major were seen sprawling in the mud, which managed to deprive some of us of our boots and socks. Some fellows stuck fast and had to be lifted up by people who had returned empty-handed from the beach. Mortars, Brens, airborne stretchers, and resuscitation boxes went under again and again. Men formed disorderly scrums, which somehow hung together and reeled towards the beach. And it is an amazing, amazing achievement that 4-4 managed to make it to the shore at all. It took hours. I think it took for the last man to get to shore was something like 4 hours, and it's 400 yards out. So that really kind of just that alone, that fact alone, shows you how difficult the conditions were. They were using their ropes to haul each other up. And the last man who made it ashore was a subaltern who was plastered in mud and completely naked because he'd had all his clothes sucked off him by the mud. So a real testament to the commandos' training. I mean, these are brave young guys. My granddad was 18. They'd been through it all at Aknakarri to get their green berets. They were not going to give up. But many of these men in the accounts that I found actually made it to shore in tears. So, if it could bring men like that to tears, and this is without even facing the Japanese. These are just the conditions in Burma, so this is really an amphibious landing like no other in the war. The fact that it was a success, and that over the coming weeks, well, not even coming weeks, it was like 10 days, the beachheads were secure. There were enough for the 74th Brigade to follow 3 Commando Brigade ashore. Getting the tanks of the 19th Lancers ashore is a whole other story. I think 2 of them were lost in the mud. One for Jack, who'll be able to go into that in more detail. Probably does in Rob's and Jack's podcast at some point. But yeah, they managed to get ashore. They managed to push the Japanese up the peninsula and reach the area of Kantha. The fighting on the Maibon Peninsula, again, was all about capturing a number of hills. They worked their way up with the tanks, so commandos working with the tanks of the 19th Lancers and followed up by the 74th Brigade. All of this is covered in the book, and I know, there's a story of a tank toppling off a hill. And my granddad actually spoke to me as well about how in Maibon, one of the things that was most difficult for him to deal with psychologically was the fact that some of the Japanese snipers would tie themselves to trees. And so even when he was going into an area and you're firing up because you're being shot at, you didn't know whether you'd killed these men or not because their bodies wouldn't fall out. And for him, that was one of the toughest things, was that psychological element, along with the fact that, these guys had cleared something like 6 square miles of jungle and hills. They hadn't really had any rations during this period. The days are hot and humid, the nights are cold, they had lice in their uniform, they hadn't really slept, running purely on adrenaline, and then the psychological elements of how the Japanese fought. Nevertheless, by the 20th of January, the Maibon Peninsula was secure, and 15 Corps had now gained this strategic foothold behind the Japanese. The stage was set for Kangor, which is probably the best known battle and element of the Third Arakan campaign. Kangor, next slide. I should have included a map that shows where it is in relation to Maibon. No, I haven't. So it's basically further to the east of Maibon. Is this village called Kangor. And the reason why Kangor was important was it was a base for the Japanese and a huge line of communications out towards the south of Arakan. And it was really where the majority of the Japanese who'd been pushed back from the other areas in Arakan had gathered. The Japanese units had been split up into these sector units. And the Kangor sector unit, they'd been told to defend the area at all costs. And they were probably one of the strongest units in Arakan at the time. Being that the sort of layout of where Kangol was, you have all these waterways coming across, sort of, you can see in the northwest there, and these big hills, West Finger and East Finger they were known as. These were heavily defended by the Japanese because the Japanese thought an attack from the Allies was going to come from either the Myohong area, where the West Africans were, or the Kantha Chong and across from Mai Bon, which would have made complete sense. However, knowing this, 15 Corps decided to do something quite crazy, really, and it was to undertake another amphibious operation. And they would go from the south. I haven't got a map of it, but they go from the south up the Dangbong Chung, and it's essentially a 22-mile journey down this kind of small tidal waterways, and it really is. This idea of Chong warfare, and this is why I came back to this idea of the naval forces in Burma being so important. This landing, when we think about commando landings, we might think of, these great beach landings. Well, not the case for 3 Commando Brigade. They became experts actually at landing on mangrove forests into thick jungle. The 2 beachheads that had been plotted for them here, we had Hove Beach and Thames Beach. And they were not really beaches. They were gaps in mangrove forests, and they were picked as the landing zones. And from there, the men would have to seize no fewer than 9 hills in order to reach the village at Kangor and block the road, which was the main aim. The Kangor blockade, as it became known, was the idea was to completely cut off the retreat of the Japanese units in the area. Not only because they wanted to contain them from the rest of Arakan, but they wanted to stop them from spilling back over the Arakan Yomas and confronting Slim's troops coming south down central Burma. So it was a really important move. It was a truly unique operation from the Army and Navy, and it began early on the morning of the 22nd of January. Because the Dangbong Chong was so narrow, these guys couldn't land from the sloops that they'd been waiting on. Instead, they had to pile into a motley array of landing craft, and it really was a motley array. The landing craft that were in Burma at this period were the dregs of what was available. Everything good, and all of the kind of modern equipment had been sent to Europe and to North Africa. And so it was anything they could get their hands on. This bizarre convoy of craft made their way down the winding through the winding chungs, and it was an incredibly tense journey. You can imagine these shallow waterways, these narrow waterways, and they're completely surrounded, almost sort of 360, by mangrove swamps and thick jungle. You can't see anything. You don't know who is on, who is at sides, on the shorelines, watching you, waiting for you. You've got the noises of the jungle, the creaks of the mangrove roots, no visibility on the banks, and these men had to be completely silent. After several hours, they reached their landing zones undetected by the Japanese, and 1 commando were again first ashore, being the most experienced, and as Darren would say, the best. I would disagree. They waded through the mangrove roots across paddy fields to dig in on the southern end of the first and largest hill, and the hill that you probably know if you know anything about Third Arakan Campaign, Hill 170. They were followed by 5 Commando, whilst 4-2 Royal Marine Commando were tasked with securing the swampy bridgehead between the 2 landing areas. Once again, 4-4 Commando, my grandfather, were last to land. The Japanese response to the landings was initially very slow, but shelling soon began. And the first night saw them launch 2 sort of probing attacks on 170, both of which were repulsed as 1 Commando begin to consolidate their position on the south of the hill. It was a very long night, that first night. The commandos were trying to suss out Japanese positions, and likewise, so it was very, very tense. But the commandos boxed in, and this is not just the boxing that the tactics that were developed by Slim, but also these kind of special commando boxes, something they learned in the Highlands in Aknakari, with overlapping areas of machine gun fire, and the discipline that these men had was incredible. They were very much came to rely on it at Kangor, this idea that you do not fire your weapons until the very, very last moment, because you do not want to give away your positions. As morning broke then on sort of the first full day at Kangor, 4-4 Commando prepared to make their move. They would leapfrog the other units and head towards a hill called Pinner. They quickly took Milford, which is in the centre, and moved on to the Pinner, which is far less well known than 170, but in my opinion, has also the same level of brutal fighting that took place. I've got a picture here. So this is one of the landing beaches. This is taken long after the landing, so you can see it's been cleared a significant amount. When the guys originally landed, the complete area was complete mangrove forest. There was no gap in it at all. So this is Pinner. It's a long, narrow hill, and this picture was taken by my grandfather when he returned to Kangor in 2005, a long time ago now. I think it's worth seeing it. There's so few photos of the Kangor area, and when you're reading the accounts, and hopefully if you do pick up a copy of my book, I've got some photos in there of the area as it is today. When 4-4 arrived initially, they found Pinner was unoccupied, so they quickly dug in. It was all quiet. It was almost a bit too quiet, and the scene was pretty much lifeless apart from the jungle around. And at the time, this hill was completely covered by jungle. It wasn't empty as it is in this photo here. It was quite thickly covered. Really, it was the calm before the storm this first night on Pinner. Beneath the moonlight, enemy artillery suddenly ranged in, and fire opened up on 4-4's northern flank. The Japanese had been carefully following 3 Commando Brigade's movements, and they were far from surprised. In fact, they knew very well that 4-4 were on Pinner. They were just waiting for their time to attack. 3 men were wounded in this initial barrage by the Japanese, but then suddenly it stopped. Silence returned to the hill, and you can imagine the men felt so tense, so unnerved at this stage. They did not know what was going on. It's pitch black but for the moonlight. They're boxed in and they're looking every which way, trying to work out where the next attack is going to come from. Suddenly, in the paddy fields that you can see here, they heard the noise of commands being shouted in Japanese. They could hear the braying of the mules, and the Japanese were advancing from the Kangor Road. The men, including my granddad, couldn't see anything. The scrub was obscuring their view, so they really had to just rely on their other senses at this point. Suddenly a red very light shot up, and all hell broke loose, and one of the fiercest battles of Kangor and really of the Arakan campaign began on Pinner. There was a vicious counterattack by the Japanese. Machine gun fire swept the forward trenches. 4-4 lost many men in this initial attack by the Japanese. And coming from the paddy field, artillery ranged in, pretty much point blank range. And there was a scramble for the Marines to hold their position. The noise was completely deafening. I think that's worth saying as well. So your senses are completely obscured at this point. There's thick smoke, and the trees that were originally on Pinner began to burst, and you got these tree bursts from the artillery shells, which caused far more problems and wounded far more men than the artillery themselves. The trees, splintered on contact with the artillery, and many of the Marines guarding the forward slope were killed. Amid the chaos, the Japanese were also quietly working their way round the hill to advance on the flanks of 4-4. Dramatic hand-to-hand fighting followed, but thanks to the remarkable discipline of the commandos, everything they had learned in their commando training, the only intruder miraculously to make it into their trenches was a porcupine who staggered into the trench alongside the RSM and expelled his quills all over him before leaving. It's amazing that these men found the humour in this at the time as well. You listen to accounts of them talking about the battle, and one moment they're discussing how her best friend has been killed and they, they've lost a comrade in the most horrific way, and in the next breath they're laughing about the regimental sergeant major telling a porcupine to F off. It's just one of those things that for me, when I listen to them talking about it, I think about my granddad in those moments as well. And it's just that camaraderie. And again, coming back to that idea of no matter what and the circumstances, the morale of being a commando, keeps you together and pulls you through. So during this one night, 4-4 lost 16 men, had 45 wounded, and Japanese dead littered the hill. Attention then turned back to 170. I'm going to hurry up because I know I've been chatting on for a while now. The Battle of 170, I know that there's been another talk for Ket on 170, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, though I happily talk about it again, at another point. But it's well known as being one of the bloodiest battles in the entire Burma campaign. Japanese resistance had massively intensified over sort of the following few days after Pinner. They believed it was critical for them to hold the road at Kangor. Indeed, it was. And the sector leader, Colonel Maruyama, had issued orders for this huge attack on 170 and had instructed his men to fight to the death. Heavy shelling proceeded at the 27th of January. It lasted for a good 2-3 days. The bombardment was so fierce that 164 shells were counted as falling within 30 minutes on the peak of it on the 28th. Peter Young, 2IC of 3 Commando Brigade, had a quote which kind of sums up this kind of chaos of this period. He said, "One shell was a direct hit on a trench where 3 artillerymen were acting as flash spotters. Hearing the shell land and the screams that followed, I ran up to see a ghastly scene. One man was practically unrecognisable as a human being. Another was running about, temporarily unhinged by the sight of his dismembered friend." And this was not a one-off. This was continuous for the 2 or 3 days that followed, culminating in this huge Japanese attack on 170 on the 31st of January. They infiltrated around one commando. They carried out a suicidal attack on the tanks of the 19th Lancers, which were on the side of the hill, and wave after wave of these suicidal attacks followed. And it was some of the most intense close quarter fighting in the entire Burma campaign. In the middle of all of this, one man's actions came to symbolise the ferocity and the determination of one commando's defence, and that is George Nobby Noland. Nolan knew that the men of 4 Troop, 1 Commando, were hanging on by a thread in an effort to prove to them that they could succeed and they could hold their positions despite this Japanese onslaught. He repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire, carrying ammunition to his men, tossing grenades, hopping from foxhole to foxhole, really urging his men on in this kind of, very kind of, I always imagine it like this Hollywood scene, something quite remarkable. One veteran commented that he didn't know if he was mad or very, very brave. He seized a 2-inch mortar, fired it from his hip in full view of the enemy, then snatched up a Tommy gun. I mean, it really is like, I don't know why they haven't done a film about it yet. Just a remarkable man, showing this courage that's just totally inspirational to his men. And it worked. His men held on until reinforcements arrived. Nolan was killed during this great act, was posthumously awarded the VC. But really, like all these awards, yes, absolutely well deserved, but there were countless acts of bravery like his that took place at Kangor. Soon the whole brigade was on 170 and involved in the battle one way or another, whether it was helping to supply those at the front, carrying supplies up the hills like these chaps are here. Every bullet, every grenade on 170 had to be hauled up from the beachhead. That in turn had to come from my bond. So again, logistics here were quite remarkable and really involved close cooperation with the Navy. And in the end, 1 Commando were relieved by 5 Commando. On the 1st of February, Maruyama lost contact with his men and ordered a withdrawal. Very, very rare thing for the Japanese to do. And in fact, some accounts that I came across of Japanese troops, they just did not want to withdraw, and they actually carried out their own kind of lone continued attacks despite having orders to withdraw. It's my dog. Please go away. But the results were remarkable. 340 Japanese dead were counted on 170 on the 1st of February, and this rose to 700 by the 3rd of February. Peter Young was quoted as saying he'd never seen dead so thick as was seen on 170, and some men were actually found alive under piles of corpses days later. For me, 170 really is a microcosm of the war in Burma, in that you had this Japanese ferocity, this relentlessness against the resolve of the commandos and the discipline of the commandos. It was these two great kind of forces coming together. And it's, in its aftermath, it left an indelible mark on all the men who fought there. And for those who fought at 170 in the years after, who very much, the name of the hill was unknown in many circles. And certainly, when I was at school, nobody knew anything about the commandos in Burma at all, never mind 170. I think descendants of those who were there know every single thing about it, because, so many of the veterans just were so proud of what they achieved there. Christensen summed it up really with this message to 3 Commando Brigade, what they achieved. And the brigade losses were quite intense. They'd suffered 45 killed and 90 wounded, which, it's a lot for the size of the brigade. It's not a lot compared to the number of Japanese that they killed. The victories at 170 and Pinner were pretty catastrophic for the Japanese forces, and the Kangor sector unit, one of the strongest in Arakan, had been almost completely destroyed. In the wider battle, 74th Brigade and the West Africans were closing in from the north. The Japanese had been crushed, but I want to kind of mention as well that the victory at Kangor was not just down to the commandos, and it's important to mention this because without the 51st Brigade of the Indian Infantry Division, they certainly would not have achieved the victory they did. In fact, the idea that it was built hill by hill, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. So 170 isn't the end. We often hear that 170 is the end of Kangor. It's not. There was fighting continued until the 18th of February, when all the hills there were cleared. And notable chap here, and I'm going to apologise for my pronunciation. I'm sure Rob can pronounce his name much better than I can. But Karendra Sabyatimya, I don't know how, that's kind of how I've pronounced his name, Rob. I'm not sure.
He was the first known as Timmy.
Timmy, that's easier. That's how I read his name in the books, but that's easier. He was the first known Indian to command an Indian infantry brigade in action when he took temporary command of the 51st Brigade during the battle. And there were many acts of bravery by the men under his command. Nag Jamal, he charged 3 bunkers while wounded, and he was recommended for the VC. He should have got the VC, in my opinion, when you read the citation, but for some reason it was downgraded to the Indian Order of Merit. This is something I found that was quite common among the Indian and African troops. I came across quite a lot of recommendations for bravery awards that were knocked down for whatever reason. I'd like to think it isn't due to prejudice, but it probably was. Anyway, so the wider fight went on, the blockade was in place, and all the features were in the hands of British, Indian, African troops by the 18th of February, and the Battle of Kangor had lasted 22 days. Japanese losses over that entire period were around about 2,000, so that's around 4/5 of their force. Allied casualties, 600. It was the decisive blow, a 15 corps campaign. They carried on pushing down Arakan. By the spring of 1945, Christensen's men had done everything that they'd been asked of them and more. Airfields had been captured that were vital for Slim's drive south. The Japanese 54th and 55th divisions had been shattered and contained, so they couldn't redeploy across to central Burma. A 15 Corps had fixed the Japanese in the west, which gave Slim this freedom to strike against Rangoon. Operation Dracula took place on May the 2nd. By the 26th Indian Infantry Division. I hadn't mentioned their attacks on Ramri and the kind of hopping down Arakan, which they did again because I've just run out of time. But they played a very important role towards the end of the campaign after 25th Indian Infantry Division had been withdrawn. The human cost of 3rd Arakan in a whole, you had 6 months of fighting, and it was resource starved as well. By the end of it, they had barely any aircraft. They had pretty much no supplies. Everything had been pushed towards 14th Army, and they were operating on a shoestring. 224 Group RAF had lost 78 aircraft. The Navy had fired 23,000 rounds, and they'd moved 54,000 men and 1,000 vehicles, which is just phenomenal in the conditions that they were fighting in. And 15 Corps had suffered 5,000 casualties, but their sacrifice had ensured that 14th Army's lifeline had remained intact, and certainly without them, Rangoon, the capture of Rangoon would have been delayed, and if not happened at all, quite frankly. Just to finish off, I just wanted to share a few photos from my grandfather's return to Burma back in 2005. 17 men from 3 Commando Brigade went back, and it's the only time a group has been back to Kangor, I think, even to date today. And it was a remarkable thing for them to do. These guys are all in their 80s by this point. My mum went with my granddad, and I know it's something that she just cherishes forever, the memories of it. And it was hugely important to them. They didn't come back to great parades at home. And my granddad fought for a long time to get the name of Kangor out there. And even today, VJ Day, it's never mentioned on TV. Nobody knows anything about it. And that was the main reason for me writing the book. It's really just to get the name out there. It's been a bit of a whirlwind talk tonight. I'm super tired, so I hope I made some sense. And I just hope that it gives you a little taste so that you can dig into this and find out more about it. Because for me, it's seeing these guys here on the hill saying they're, remembering those who didn't come back. That's what it's all about, really. Thank you for watching.
Well, that's amazing, Lucy. Thank you very much indeed. We've had a few questions. I've answered one immediately. This is from Rob, who knows a lot about COP and pilotage. Nice to see you on tonight, Rob.
Yes, hi, Rob.
Was the general Japanese attitude, we can't defend all these riverbanks, so we'll keep lookouts who can be alert to landings and then respond as strongly as we can to marshal our forces. That's pretty much it. I mean, the problem with Sakurai and Arakan in 45 is he didn't know what was going on, and he needed to be able to respond where he could. And I think this is the point. But there's a question here directly for Lucy. Lucy, what would you say were the main achievements of the third Arakan campaign? And this is from Christopher Watts. Actually, you could ask the same of the first 2 campaigns. Well, quite right, Christopher. Now, this is the point. Were they anything other than a sideshow with the main war against the Japs in central and northern Burma? Now, I've got a strong view on this. I'd be interested in hearing yours.
So, well, without Arakan, without capturing the airfields, the supply in central Burma wouldn't have happened. They couldn't reach past Mandalay, Rob, something like that. So there would have been no way to supply the 14th Army. So a sideshow. No, I don't think so. It occurred on the side, but it was really the linchpin of it. It was the supporting rod to the entire reconquest of Burma. Got no supplies, got no logistics, you got no fighting force.
Completely right. And of course, the Arakan flank, the littoral, was highly vulnerable to Slim's forces going down through central Burma. So if you think about where the Irrawaddy Delta is, once you cross the An Pass from Arakan, you're into Prome. And that was a very weak flank for Slim, certainly as he was going south. And Arakan definitely needed to be captured. But I think there are lots and lots of lessons, and I'll just make a quick point here. Lots of lessons about the nature of warfare in Arakan. And I do love the story of the 81st and 82nd West Africans marching down the Culloden Valley, as Lucy said. They were on air supply for 9 months. They fought little skirmishes. They didn't fight any major battles, but by their action, they forced Sakurai to evacuate Akyab. And 2,500 years ago, Sun Tzu said, the most brilliant form of military leadership is fighting a war where you don't have to kill anybody. You can win battles without killing people. And Arakan, certainly the actions of the 81st and 82nd, demonstrated that you could achieve something really quite strategic and significant without necessarily a confrontational battle. And Akyab was therefore taken, much to the chagrin of the commandos, with no action on the beaches. there's lots of really useful chat, great fun chat. Thank you very much indeed for all of that. But I think we'll now hand back to Sylvia.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. And Lucy, thank you so much. The response that we've had this evening is immense, which I'll share with you later on. I mean, the detail that you brought to such a brutal campaign and the magnitude of the campaign and the huge difficulties faced, it's just, as I say, it was the detail for me that stood out, and completely brilliant. Thank you very, very much. And we're so grateful to you and all our speakers who contribute their time for free to help promote KET and to raise money for the work we do in Nagaland. So to remind those of you who know and to tell those of you who don't, we are a charity run by volunteers. So if you enjoyed the webinar tonight, do feel free to donate. You can do this on our website, and where you will find copies of Lucy's book, Jungle Commandos, if you prefer to support us that way. And as we've heard from Rob and many others, this is a book not to miss and a brilliant addition to your Burma campaign libraries. And with thanks to Lucy's publisher, Osprey Books, KET is able to offer this book for sale while making a little bit of money for our work in Nagaland. On the shop, we've got lots of other books for sale, including all of Rob's, plus a beautiful selection of Naga crafts handmade in Naga homes. So keep those orders coming in, and I enjoy supplying them. I've mentioned our work in Nagaland a few times. Our main project is getting ready to launch very soon. We are funding our partners ECS to operate a mobile teaching unit, which will work in very remote and extremely poor areas of Nagaland, where teachers are scarce, particularly in maths and science. Locations are extremely remote and the infrastructure is weak. The mobile teaching unit will focus on 10 village schools in the remote northeast of Nagaland, when we're aiming to reach between 900 and 1,000 school children aged between 8 and 14. The project will go on for 3 years, and the main aim is that each of those 1,000 children will be able to leave school with some maths, numeracy, and knowledge of science. And here in the UK, we are offering bursaries to Naga students studying in the UK. We have awarded 6 so far in total, and we are looking forward to bringing you updates on the students' progress. And if you'd like to know more about our work, either of these projects or anything else, please don't hesitate to contact me or have a look on our website, which I'm sure you know where to find us. So thanks for joining us tonight. And as Rob has already said, thanks for your brilliant chat. We get all the chat afterwards, and I'll make sure that we follow up any of you that asked questions or had comments and told us about your fathers and grandfathers, which is always wonderful to see. So we will pick that up. Our next webinar is on March 26th, when Catherine Venables will present the story of a mobile surgical unit. And I know there's some medical interested people on board tonight. So I hope you can join us then. Until then, good night.